okay, that works. So seriously, I hate to disappoint you, but I always tell people that we don't predict the future at the Institute for the Future, and we firmly believe that nobody can predict the future, and if somebody tells you otherwise, just don't believe them, especially if they're from California. So what we do at the Institute, this is going to be a problem, right? Let's see, is there another clicker or? The future is magical, right? It's like you wave this wand and it may work and it may, okay, there you go. So despite the fact that we don't predict the future, what the Institute does and what we're all about is we systematically think about the future in order to help people make better decisions. So the success of what we do is ultimately judged on did we help somebody make a better decision and prepare for a better future or help shape a more desirable future. And the cycle that we talk about is called foresight to insight to action. We firmly believe that every successful strategy is based on a really good insight about the future. So in order to get there, you need to understand what are potential, what are the signals. A lot of work that we do at the Institute is looking at signals. So when you think about the future, you all know this famous phrase, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, by William Gibson. So a lot of our work is looking at those signals. What are people doing that's weird, that's strange, that seems like it's completely different? And then we try to basically create patterns. If you bring all these signals together, what's the larger story they're telling us about the direction of change, about the transformations? So those are signals, and you're going to hear me talk about signals. Silicon Valley is a great place to be looking at signals and really asking yourself a question, is this a signal or is this a noise? That's a lot of our work. That's a foresight. And then we work with organizations and foundations and governments to say, what's the insight, the same foresight, but maybe very different insight for a different organization? And ultimately, that's back to that, to help people make better decisions. So what actions can you take today or tomorrow to shape the future or to prepare for that future? So that's a foresight to insight to action. And one of the things that we've been doing at the Institute is we use this framework that we call a two-curve framework that actually comes from Ian Morrison, who was president of the Institute a while back. And basically, this framework says that in any period of large transformation that we believe we're in right now, we're kind of coexisting along the same two curves. One is the declining or incumbent curve. This is basically means we've lived like that for a long time. We have institutions built up. We have regulations. We know how to live on that curve. But that way of doing things is kind of on the decline. And a lot of our work is then looking at this emerging new curve that's happening at the same time, along which we can only probably at the beginning just see signals of it. But a lot of our work, this is a new way of doing things and understanding what are the likely shapes of this curve, what is different. That's a new way of doing things. So that's kind of the framework that we're using. And when we think about why we're in this period of transformation, what's underlining that? When I was writing my book, The Nature of the Future, Paul Barron, probably familiar to many of you in the room, he was one of the founders of the Institute, co-founders of the Institute for the Future, and he also developed something called packet switching technology, which is basically a foundational technology for the internet. So we were looking through archives and papers that Paul Barron wrote. By the way, he made some pretty astounding predictions about the uses of the ARPANET, among others. So I came across this paper that he wrote in 1964 when he was working at RAND. And at the time, he and others were working on developing a more resilient telecommunications infrastructure because our infrastructure was highly centralized, looked like that figure on the left. And so, if you wanted to attack it, destroy it, all you had to do is target a few central nodes, and basically you take down the whole infrastructure, and it's very hard to recover from that. So he and others basically were suggesting moving to a much more highly decentralized and ultimately a highly distributed infrastructure. That's basically the internet, the foundation of the internet. And there are several important pieces of that that probably you're all familiar with, which is that in that infrastructure, large chunks of data are broken down into smaller pieces, into bits, and they can travel down multiple paths, and they get reassembled at the end. And what's important about it, of course, it's large chunks of data broken down into smaller pieces. It's emergent. You don't know which path this information is going to take, and it's much more resilient because you can take down several nodes and information can still pass through. This has become the nervous system of our economy, of our society, of everything we do, of our leisure. And this is a foundational infrastructure. When it becomes this nervous system for everything we do, it's not just about technology. It's really changing the nature of our economies, the nature of our organizations, the nature of our society. And in many ways, what I see is that our social and economic infrastructure is beginning to mirror this. We're moving away from a lot of value creation that was highly centralized into much more distributed and much more decentralized way of creating value. And there is a kind of an economic foundation. Why? Why is that? Ron Coase, who was a Nobel Prize economist in 1934, he, by the way, died 37. He passed away 2 years ago at the ripe age of 106. So I kind of tend to believe that he must have been right on some things, especially this. He asked this simple question: why do we need organizations? Why do we need these formal centralized structures? Why not people just trading individually, selling things to each other, which is something we've done for most of our human existence, really. And his answer was simple, is that when you scale production, when you scale up what you're doing, you need to manage a lot more resources. You need to manage more people. You need to invest in capital. So you have these transaction costs. The transaction costs increase. And it's really efficient to bring these transaction costs down, to bring all of that under one roof. It's not efficient for each individual to be doing and buying these resources on their own. So when you think about it, that it's really about transaction costs, really start thinking that institutions, in a way, that we've built up over the last 200 years are a kind of technology. It's basically a technology that helps us scale up production while minimizing costs and maximizing profits. And that's really exactly what's being disrupted. And many people have written about it, Clay Shirky and others, which is now, today, you can be Wikipedia and have fewer than 200 employees and basically create a resource that no Encyclopedia Britannica with millions of dollars of investment and thousands of people working on it could even potentially create. So all of a sudden, we're in a situation where transaction costs are radically, radically decreased for many, many things. And it's possible for one individual or a few individuals to create value on the scale that previously took a large organization to do, or no organization could. And that's really the nature of the future. That's the nature of this transformation. And by the way, I'm not saying that all the institutions are going to go away and all the organizations are going away, but it's that the economic underpinnings for a lot of the things that we built up on this first curve are being disrupted. And that a lot of new ways of doing things that really capitalizing on these low transaction costs are beginning to take shape. And so what I thought I would do is just give you a few examples of where we see this happening. We're seeing it in the domain of work and how people work. We're seeing it in science. We're seeing it in education. I can take virtually every domain. Media was probably the first domain where we felt it really seriously. But I'm just going to talk about work and science. So back to that two-curve framework. So really, when I think about these two curves, the incumbent curve is this curve of institutional production, and the sort of nascent emergent curve is a curve of social structured creation, which I define as basically creating value by aggregating small contributions from large networks of people using various platforms and social tools and technologies and the whole internet infrastructure that we've created. And again, I'm emphasizing it doesn't mean that everything is going to be done this way. But if you're in an organization, you really have to be thinking, if I were starting whatever I'm doing today with today's technology infrastructure and today's costs, how would I do it today? So in terms of organizations and work, we're kind of, I think we're stuck in the age of platforms. So if I apply that diagram to organizations moving through centralized formal organizations, we're moving clearly into the world of platforms. We're in it right now. There's a new platform born every day, whether it's Uber or Ship or Postmate or all of these other things, which kind of makes sense because if everybody is now connected, connecting these transactions becomes really important. And we're beginning to see this kind of real peer-to-peer, real sort of decentralized, distributed production, mostly really in social movements. If you think about things like Occupy or protest in Hong Kong, there seems to be no platform. There seems to be no central organizational nodes. People are just coordinating peer-to-peer, and so suddenly these things appearing. So in terms of work, no surprise, we now have these kinds of companies that basically are offering you to create an Uber-like application for everything, right? Because we're all now nodes in this distributed network. So it's no wonder that we have Uber-like platforms emerging in everything, right? Because, well, you can basically Uberize weed delivery and hiring coders and plumbers and all kinds of things that you can now sort of create using these kinds of platforms, right? So there's a lot of controversy about this, and kind of let's apply it to the world of work. What are we seeing emerging in this landscape? We do a lot of ethnographic work where we interview and follow and observe practices of these new people, these new inhabitants, and studying their new practices, and we see kind of these new worker archetypes emerging. There's a lot of controversy about these platforms. You know, you've seen all the controversy about Uber. Some people say this is horrible, it's not sharing, it's basically you're dividing the scraps. Other people are saying this is the greatest thing in the world because your costs are going down. And oftentimes when we move into a new arena, something completely new, I talk about we're all immigrants to the future, right? And as an immigrant, we're all immigrants to this future. We don't have the language to talk about it. We don't know what it is. We need to really kind of explore. There's probably positives and negatives in each one of those. We need to evolve new language. We probably need to create a whole new ecosystem to support and enable this kind of new work. So let's talk about the archetypes that came out of our research. So the micro worker, these are people who are maybe signed on 3, 4, 5 different platforms like Uber, Lyft, Postmate, all of the others. And instead of thinking of work as a 9-to-5 job, where I have to be 9 to 5 because somebody told me to do that, I say I'm available from 9 to 11 in the morning, and that is what I'm going to do from 9. So you basically fit work. You basically took the idea of a job and you broke it down into micro pieces into these tasks, and you make yourself available for certain tasks. I think we're really at the early stages of this evolution. There's all kinds of services and platforms emerging that would help support that. But this is one kind of worker. The next kind of archetypes, there's a whole generation. We're full of them here in Silicon Valley. There are platform makers. People are looking for those niches where you can connect. Maybe it's weed delivery, maybe it's coding, maybe it's something else, maybe it's tutoring. But all these platform makers who are looking for these opportunities to develop this and take advantage of these possibilities. The other one is what we call an amplified entrepreneur. These are people who are maybe one person, usually it is one person, but they basically command an army of other people who are doing various things for them. So think about hiring people on Odesk who do tasks for you. So these people, maybe they're sitting in their pajamas all day, but they literally command an army of people who are doing things for them. Maybe they're doing accounting, maybe they're doing coding, maybe they're doing renting for various things, maybe they're hiring TaskRabbiters. But basically, that's the idea, that today it's possible for you to sit in your pajamas at home and command an army of people to create kind of what before you needed a whole organization to do. The dream builders is another interesting archetype because these people are totally separated what they do to make a living, to support their livelihoods, and what their passions are. So maybe by day, they may be working on some of these platforms, or maybe they're working in some organizations, but really what their energy and what their drive is dedicated to is maybe being in tech shop, or maybe it's a music incubator, or it's a community of makers and creators and artists. So people are sort of separated. You know, this thing about you have to find your meaning in work. A lot of these people are finding their meaning somewhere else, and there are a lot of options for them to do that today. And finally, what we call the culture hackers. These people, if dream builders are separating livelihoods and their passions, these people are just the opposite. They're basically kind of challenging some of the traditional institutions. So they're creating co-housing places and co-working places and saying, why should I separate work and life? It's one continuous stream. And we want to redefine these notions of everything that's there. So it's people who are creating embassy networks and all kinds of other co-housing and communal and other kinds of arrangements. Again, Silicon Valley is a great place for looking at that. And this is, as I said, this is early on. These are like archetypes. These are the immigrants. You know, we're learning from their behaviors what this new system is. And I think in the process, we're kind of creating a whole new ecosystem for work. Like, what does insurance look like in this kind of environment? What products do these people need? What's the safety net that's needed for this kind of work? And once it's out of the bag, you can't put it back. This is happening. People are going to be working like that, and that's going to be taking place. So instead of, I think the political conversation and policy conversation needs to shift, first of all, to let it evolve rather than killing it from the very beginning, because we don't know what this animal it is. It's alien in many ways. And let it emerge, and then think about what's the new ecosystem that we need to create to enable and support this, and correct it in some ways, if needed. So that's the work area. And let me just talk about another area that's interesting, which is an area of science. We are truly in an area where, in a time when it's possible for a lot more people to participate in science as an endeavor, in research as an endeavor. It doesn't have to always happen with highly credentialed scientists, and they're part of it. But there are a lot of more possibilities for basically creating a big science endeavor that envelops and takes in a lot more people. Why that it's the case? First of all, we have a lot of research tools that previously were very expensive, unaffordable, inaccessible, becoming accessible to a lot more people. If you think about it, this was just an article in the New York Times, you can basically equip your kitchen as a lab. Or you can go to tech shop, Jim's tech shop, and get access to a lot of those resources. Tech shop has always been a signal for us for like 8 years now, so you're still a good signal. But basically, all these tools are becoming accessible. If you think about your phone or all these things people are carrying on themselves, that's a science tool. That's a research tool. It's a tool for collecting data. It's a tool for sensing a lot of different things. So you can now buy probably 50 different attachments to your smartphone to do everything from looking into your ear to inspecting your eye to doing all kinds of things with it. And not surprisingly, as a part of it, what you have this emergence of this whole quantified self movement that's taking advantage of that. That's a large, the first quantified self meeting was at the Institute for the Future, and 8 people showed up, and that was probably 5 years ago. And they were like, what are you measuring? What are you doing? What are you doing? Within a year, we couldn't accommodate them anymore. And now it's a huge movement of people who are self-measuring, and not just self-measuring, but also potentially conducting clinical experiments with this data and analyzing all this data. I like this site called Randomize Me. You think like clinical trials are incredibly expensive and hard to do, and it's only large organizations that can get those and grants and that investment. But there is this site where you can propose to do a clinical study of something. It could be something really silly, like is drinking green tea gives me more energy. You can recruit people to participate in the study with you. They'll give you a protocol and a template for doing that. And basically, there's probably somebody in the community who is a statistician who can help you analyze the data. And voila, you have a clinical trial. I know a lot of people in academia probably would argue with this, but you know, people can do, science has not always been preserved of certain ivory places. So that's one piece. And by the way, you don't even have to have those small devices as science or a cell phone. If you want to get access to large, very expensive devices like huge observatories and others, a lot of them are connected online, and you can participate in analyzing data. You can be a part of the experiments. You could be discovering new holes on the moon or new spots all over the world. This is, Space Hack is a site that a colleague of ours, Ariel Waldman, put together, which lists hundreds of places for collaborative science, where citizen scientists can work together to do all kinds of amazing things. And some of the recent articles and discoveries included references to thousands of people who participated in this kind of discovery. So tools are becoming available and democratized. And then we also have democratization of data. If you look at what's happening with data, a lot more publications in open science magazines. People are encouraged to publish a lot more. There are places like this site at Harvard where researchers can share their data sets, and that's becoming a lot more common, where people are contributing results of their experiments. And there's even very sort of sensory-rich places where people are sharing video of how did they conduct the experiment. So you have basically a guided tour. If you want to do this experiment, this is how you do it. So that's another piece of it. The other interesting sort of development is the kind of evolution of a lot of new crowdfunding platforms for science, not just Kickstarter and others, but really science-specific crowdfunding platforms. This is actually coming out of BioCurious, which is a community lab here in Sunnyvale, where they have this project on glowing plant. These are planting basically seeds for trees that fluoresce at night. Their hypothesis, and you can argue whether it's good or bad, it's been somewhat controversial, but their hypothesis is that you can save on electricity if you have basically these natural trees providing lighting. And this is what they got on Kickstarter to basically follow and create this experiment. And they're actually selling it now. But there's a whole bunch of other platforms, and again, new ones every time. This is a biology research mycorrhiza. This is something started by Georgia Tech, which is kind of interesting because universities are now jumping into the game and saying, hey, we can microfund and crowdfund our own research and our own discoveries. And finally, another piece of this story is the evolution of all these alternative science communities that are not necessarily based in R&D labs, or they're not based in universities. Sometimes they have connections, but they are appearing all over the place, One of them is, this is BioCurious, actually. This is a community lab that's a membership, just like the tech shop, but focuses on synthetic biology. It's fascinating when you look at these stories. You pay a membership fee, and people are of all backgrounds and ages can come and work together. And if you think about it, I've been doing a lot of work on, we're very concerned about science education in this country. And if you look at data, what you see is that most people, even young people who want to major in science, drop out after the first year of college. They don't pursue science degrees. Well, the reason for that is we've created this gated system of you have to have this sequence in calculus, and you have to have this kind of thing. So it turns so many people off. And these kinds of spaces are opening up possibility for everybody, anybody who is interested in science to become a part of this community. There are classes that are being offered. They're all becoming scientists across ages, across background. A lot of engineers are participating in biology research and so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting gen space, very similar to BioCurious, but on the East Coast in New York. This is Science Hack Day, organized by Ariel Waldman. You have a question that you want to keep?
You should just mention in the BioCurious picture what the young lady is doing.
Do you know what she's doing?
Yes, she's teaching the class.
Even better. Thank you. Are you a BioCurious member?
A friend of mine.
Cool. Yeah, I love BioCurious. This is a Science Hack Day organized by Ariel Waldman, who I mentioned, where she basically brings people together for 48 hours. We've done it at the Institute. We've done it in other spaces, where people come together and work on whatever projects they're interested in working. Nobody manages them. Nobody tells them what to do. So they self-organize and produce really remarkable results. I don't have time to go into what some of the projects have been. And interestingly, they do attract scientists from Berkeley and Stanford and other places, but they also attract amateurs. So think about it. They don't have role descriptions. They don't have management mandates. They're just self-organizing and doing these kind of remarkable things. And of course, there's Tech Shop. I have to bring it up, which is another amazing community and space for science and technology and a lot of other things, really interesting social things going on in that space. And the problem with thinking about the future is that we always think we think in terms of our lifespan. So we think that, and it's usually, give or take 100 years. So we always think things have always been like that. We always have to conduct science in universities and colleges, and we always have to work in these kinds of organizations. But as futurists, we're as much as historians as we're futurists, because we have to look sometimes thousands of years back and say, wage labor is a relatively recent phenomenon, about 300 years. The idea that we will sell our time for money is relatively, if you look at the whole history of human existence, that's a very small portion of how we've lived. If you look at the whole idea of universities and science, these people were scientists. They worked in their home labs. They worked in these communities. And I think there is a tremendous, as much as there is a lot of things that you can be pessimistic about when you think about the future, from climate change to all kinds of things. There's such amazing possibilities inherent in this new infrastructure that a lot of people in this room and others, we built this over the last 40 years. It doesn't just came out of nowhere. And it gives us this possibility to really think differently about how we live. What is work? How do we sustain livelihood? What is research? What is scientific discovery? That really gives me a lot of hope about the future. Okay, questions? Yes? Yeah. I'll shout. Shouting works.
Thank you for clarifying all these archetypes. Now I finally start to have some idea about my 2.5-year-old grandson, because when he wakes up, the first thing he looks for is an iPad. And he likes to wave at things while we taught him that, no, you have to really do certain gesture to for example, like change one cartoon to the other. I mean, so the question I have here is, obviously we need to change the paradigm of education platform. Will you share some insight? Because obviously that's the bottleneck at this moment.
Yeah. Yes, education is one of my passions, and I totally agree with you. And we are changing the paradigm of education. Again, it's happening in pockets outside. I think Tech Shop is a great educational platform. I think, you guys went to Arizona State. Arizona State is one of the more enlightened universities that is seeing this potential. And you're seeing kind of pockets of that happening in education. The problem is, you have a whole economic system that supports kind of a legacy infrastructure, and some of it is good. You don't want to disrupt everything. You don't want to change everything. Some of it really works, but you have a whole economic system behind it. Clay Christensen talks about why it's difficult for legacy organizations to move into the new space. It's very difficult for government officials to think differently. And these are complex issues, but I totally agree with you that this education system is not serving the needs by and large. But I think that there is movement and realization. It's probably going to take 5 to 10 years for people to really understand that. This is a long-term transformation. This is going to be unrolling over the next 20 years, probably.
But the U.S. Educational platform has gone through a transformational move in the 1960s, right? I mean, why it was done more effectively back then, not in the 21st century?
It's interesting. We just had we had Tom Friedman at the Institute on Friday, and he was talking about his new book that he's writing, and he's talking about everything becoming faster. Everything becoming faster. Technology, you all know it's exponential and this and that. Humans don't change fast. Cultures don't change fast. People's minds are hard to change. Traditional ways of doing things. So we're kind of at this gap between technology changing really fast and this very slow evolving. And there's a good reason for that. Maybe we don't want to change that fast. Maybe it's a good thing, but there is this gap. And particularly institutions don't change fast, unless you have a revolution, which hopefully we won't. Yeah.
Hi, eloquently stated. In the press and media, they've been talking about the micro workers, as you were indicating, and there's a lot of criticisms about workers' rights, how much money they're going to make, health care. Could you comment on what's going to happen socio-economically with these new types of people?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that the conversations get so polarized, and that's one of those issues that's becoming so polarized. When you actually talk to people who are doing that, there are huge advantages. My son is working for SHIP, which is one of these platforms. He's a musician. You couldn't pay him to work in an organization. He is one of these dream builders or others. So he's making that choice, as well as many other people are making that choices. So I think that we're doing a disservice by polarizing the conversation so much. Now, do I believe that we need to start thinking about a whole new generation of services and products and other social safety net for these people? It's beginning to happen, but we can facilitate that. We can help with that. There's a new insurance product that out of Oakland called Even. So the problem with gig workers is that you can make money 1 month and then maybe you don't have anything. So it's basically providing insurance to equalize your earnings, to help you equalize your earnings. Those are the kind of things we need to be thinking about. What is the nature of this new way of sustaining livelihoods, and what is it that we need to establish? All the systems that we've created came out of basically 100 years ago, they're not working for this generation. So we better start thinking about it. So we really would like to bring the two together and have a productive conversation. I also do believe that, you know, some of the platforms are designed, right? Their algorithms are designed. So who is to tell us that we can't put some social justice or basically basic equity? Can we design for that? Why are we not having this conversation on a large scale? So why don't we talk to Uber and others about designing, or maybe it's not Uber, maybe it's somebody else who will be doing it, but you can integrate those ideals into design because these platforms didn't come from above. They're designed by people. Yeah.
I wonder if you could point to any thoughts about how this affects the design of future of, shall I say, filters for social good. Obviously, there are some scientific inventions which can be quite dangerous, and reason research institutions have been around is to filter those out before they get in the wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, clearly, no technology doesn't, any technology comes with its evil, and including existing ones. So how do you design for filters? I'm just going to give you an example. One of our fellows at the Institute is Tim Huang, and he's designing social bots for peace. So basically what these social bots are doing, it's probably the same technologies that could be used for very nefarious things, but he's designing technologies that connects people on Twitter who maybe have similar interests in peace building or social equity and social justice, and he's helping them coalesce and become more of a force. So I think there's also potential for that, to connect the people with good ideas and good goals using the same set of technologies. I think it's a design, right? It's a design issue. And if there's anything that I would love to see more of, you know, we're talking a lot about coding skills and all of that, which I think are really important. But I wish all the engineers and people who are designing also had humanistic skills, right? So I wish they all took philosophy and history and all these other things, because I think it's really important for us to marry the social sciences and the technology. It's not about just coding skills. I would hate to see a whole generation of people who all they know is how to code without any kind of social awareness of the larger world and the history and all of those really difficult human dilemmas that we have to think about when we develop technologies.
Do you have any comments about Bitcoin?
Telecom?
Bitcoin?
Bitcoin, oh my gosh. I probably would like to, do you?
Well, it's almost like everything I'm hearing you talk about, it seems like it relates to disruptions in
Yeah.
economic structures and
Yeah.
empowering people on to crowdfund
Yeah.
things. And you know, you asked about why. I don't know, the idea of the Securities and Exchange Commission came up in my mind when you started talking about equity in society. And,
Yeah.
you know, so it's interesting that for the first time in a long time, we're having creativity. People are free to innovate in the economic system, whereas before, people's, you know, the government was in the way of allowing that kind of innovation to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll talk to you maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, that's
afterward,
interesting. We have a working group at the Institute on cryptocurrency, and some of the people who are designing and thinking about it. And so My approach is let's study it, let's understand it, because a lot of people are talking about it, but they really don't know what they're talking about. So I think it's one of those phenomena. It's alien, but let's explore it and let's think about the possibilities. It's definitely really interesting. And I think it goes hand in hand. One of the other projects we're doing is on second-generation internet, because we conceived of the internet as a pure peer-to-peer infrastructure, right? If you look at communications in the early days of the internet, they were highly distributed. Now they go through gates. We're in the platform world, right? So just as we're talking about sort of Bitcoin as this peer-to-peer currency, we have potential to recreate or take back the real peer-to-peer internet, and it may look very, very different. So to me, the two go hand in hand. I think long-term, you know, the age of platforms is here and now, and I think ultimately we are going to move. I believe in that Paul Barron vision, that ultimately we're going to move into much more highly distributed infrastructure of everything, including money, including the foundational infrastructure of the internet and communications and other things. So, I mean, to me, Bitcoin is one. There are other currencies that you can think about, but they're part of the same sort of movement. Yeah, one more.
Great talk. 2 questions. How do you monetize the Institute for the Future? What's the model that you have to monetize your work? And the second thing is, what are the 3 key takeaways for entrepreneurs? Entrepreneurship is great, and there's a lot of ideas here. But what would be the top 3 takeaways for people who are working in big enterprises and can make use of your ideas?
So let me just, there was an echo, so I didn't hear very well. But the 3 top takeaways for enterprises to think about. I think one takeaway, if I were in a company today, I would look at every part of my operation and ask yourself a question. If I were doing it today or inventing it today with today's set of technologies, how would I organize it? How would I organize it differently? Or maybe you would say it's the same. Look at your sort of transaction costs. Another takeaway, because of the rate of change and because of we're surrounded by these signals, and I'm biased, but I think the practice of looking at the future and integrating it into your strategy, into your vision, it's a really critical skill and competency that you need to have in an organization. When I first came to the Institute, which was 16 years ago, there was our community were futurists, or maybe they were not called futurists, but they were in the foresight function in organizations. That function has disappeared with the dot-com bubble burst and all of that. That function has disappeared and it's become dispersed. But I think it's a really critical part of organizational intelligence. You cannot have a good strategy if you're not thinking about the future, if you're not picking up on signals, if you're not part of the community that you're talking to, all of those things. So that's my other takeaway. And the third takeaway is I always we as futurists are trained to look at the invisible and what is it that you're not seeing because you're in the organization? You know, trained to become an anthropologist and ethnographer. Most of the people at the institutes were not trained as ethnographers. I was trained as an economist. But one of the first things you get trained is understanding, picking up, and observing. The power of observation is really, really important. Thank you. Thank you.